Welcome back to an episode of Not a Lady, a Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman podcast. This is Kelly.
And I'm Sarah.
And this is episode 5 of season 1, titled The Healing.
And before we jump right in with talking about the episode, our last podcast, we gave a challenge and an invitation to listeners. Again, I want to give credit where credit is due. I did not come up with this idea myself. The amazing ladies who host podcasts over at Fascination and Frustration play what they call a lessons game with their listeners, where listeners have the opportunity to write in after the discussion of a certain episode and can write any lessons that either they, the listener, or lessons they believe those characters learned in that particular episode. Our last podcast, we talked about Law of the Land, guest starring Johnny Cash, and we did have a lesson write-in. And so I'm excited to share it with you, Kelly, and just hear if you have any thoughts.
Okay.
So this is from the Instagram account Lisa Farber King 6, and her lesson was, as we see more and more people unable to afford food, it was almost current that John stole because his family was starving. And here's the lesson. It is all too easy to judge others without taking into account the circumstances. What would you do to feed your family? Would you steal? I think the episode pointed out the difference between law and justice.
Nice. No, I completely agree. I think it is very easy to judge people, but we have no idea how we would respond in certain situations, so...
Really good lesson.
I like it.
So be sure, after the end of this episode, on any of our social medias, feel free to write in lessons that you learned, as well as any lessons you think any of the characters, and there are a lot of lessons in this particular episode, so we're looking forward to hearing what you guys think.
I also personally just wanted to give a shout out for everybody that is still listening, as we've actually seen that we have listeners from 19 different countries, which again is still blowing my mind because I did not expect that. And it's really neat to see that. I mean, Dr. Quinn was obviously, based in the United States, the show, and just talking about where the show was filmed and such, but it's really neat that we've had so many people from different countries listen in. And
je sais que nous avons un certain nombre d'auditeurs français. Je suis désolée que mon français n'est pas le meilleur, mais la France est un endroit important pour nous parce que je suis née en France et ma sœur a regardé Dr. Quinn pour la première fois en France. Et donc, nous sommes si heureux que vous écoutiez notre podcast et merci beaucoup.
I don't even know what you said, but it sounded awesome.
I just thought we've had a lot of people, especially on our social media, right, that they are listening from France, and even on Facebook, some groups have been shared. So, yeah, it's exciting for us.
And Kelly did minor in French, so she was excited when French fans were posting and she could read what they were saying.
Exactly.
So this episode aired on the 23rd of January, 1993. The director was Gwen Arner, and she, prior to this, actually had directed 13 episodes of The Waltons.
Oh, nice.
She directed other stuff too, but that was the only title I knew. She will actually go on to direct a total of 12 Dr. Quinn episodes. And the writers, obviously, Beth Sullivan still gets credit as creator, but the two co-writers we had for this episode were Sarah Davidson. In her repertoire, she had 54 episodes of Dr. Quinn that she was linked to. And in more than one job, from writer to producer to... She had like all sorts of jobs listed. So this is a woman who was very involved in this show for quite a few years. And a return from last week's co-writer, Tony Perling.
So let's kick it off. We start this episode by Dr. Mike and the kids walking in town, and kind of immediately, I guess I was a little confused, right? Because they don't show the whole context. I think Brian says, like,
I want to learn. Can you teach me? And then Matthew's like, the Reverend doesn't want anyone touching it.
But we don't really know what they're talking about, right? Like, we have no idea. And then the camera pans over, and we see that they are unloading a piano. And kind of immediately, as they're trying to unload this piano from the wagon, Lauren hurts himself, kind of keels over.
All those useless young men hanging around there, and they got the old shopkeeper doing the bottom, catching the... Sully's up in the cart, and then you have Lauren down, and I'm like, come on, Jake. Come on, Hank. You guys are in everything. Why are you not doing this?
Yeah, but knowing Lauren, he probably wouldn't have let him anyway, so...
Yeah, probably. But I think someone makes a good point of, like, why are we unloading it here? And then the Reverend's like, oh, we'll get a cart and take it over to the church. And I'm like, wait.
What? It's on a cart.
Or it's on a wagon. I don't,
Yeah.
maybe I don't know the difference between a cart and a wagon, but I'm kind of like, work smarter, not harder, guys.
Yeah, no, it seems like a lot of extra work to do that twice. But Myra runs over from the saloon, and she's basically like, Dr. Mike, you gotta come see this guy. Not sure what's happened. And so, sure enough, they find a client, and he's in the back room, and he's dead. Dr. Mike confirms that he's dead. It's kind of weird to me how everybody just, like, follows.
Oh, it's so weird.
Yeah, including Horace, which is probably awkward.
Well, also, I think we talked about this in the pilot, how this is, a family-friendly show, right? A show that plays at what would be considered, like, the family hour, and how you can have an event like this where they really tiptoe around saying what actually happened or what was going on through the entire episode. And it's not just like Myra trying to explain to Dr. Mike and then Dr. Mike trying to explain to everyone, and then later Sully comes in and is trying to, and then there's like Hank is like, well, he died happy, and I'm like,
I know,
some kid somewhere is like, oh, he was sleeping and he was happy and he died.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's entertaining, I suppose, to see how they try and get around actually saying anything that would be labeled as, adult content.
Meanwhile, everyone watching is just like, this is weird.
Yeah.
But Dr. Mike is like, well, let's take him to my clinic because she wants to do an autopsy. And do you feel like most people know what autopsies are? I feel like most people know what autopsies are.
If they watch crime shows, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. I'm like, anybody that turns on CBS, at 7, 8, 9 o'clock.
You know what's interesting, though? There was a time where especially the church was very against autopsies because it and I think Sully alludes to it from the Cheyenne perspective, but just like, well, I think a lot of what we know about medicine is started out through autopsies and studying how people died, why people died, whatever, like understanding the human body. But if you go back to like Greek and Roman time periods, like it was punishable by death to touch a dead body, much less study it or cut it open or whatever, like, because it was unclean. It was, and like this idea of what does it do to the soul if you damage the body.
Right. But this reminds me of, I'm pretty sure you watched the movie The Physician on Netflix, didn't you?
Oh yeah, like a really long time ago.
Okay, well, I recommend that movie. It's very good. It's called The Physician. But it's very much like this, where you don't actually know what the heart looks like or the lungs because they've never seen. It's just a very educated guess.
Does it have Ben Kingsley in it?
Yeah, he's kind of the physician teacher. So it's a very good movie, and I won't give too much away, but they do come across this, like you said, this conflict of religious background, but also physicians that are in training that want to know more and understand more. And the way to do that would be to investigate a dead body. So for those who don't know, let me just humor you. Autopsies, it's basically just a surgical procedure in which you dissect and examine a corpse to determine the mode, the manner, the cause of death, but also to just, look for disease, injury, and today that would be, normally pathologists do that, but a lot of times in medical shows you'll see medical examiners, coroners, and they're the ones that are allowed to look for cause of death. But in this case, Dr. Quinn wants to figure out, okay, why did this guy die? Because at this point we don't have really any reasoning of why he would have died. That was common because autopsies they weren't popular. They didn't become popular until the 1800s, but it was common. And so I think for them in rural Colorado, probably not a thing that they knew about, but it was something that was happening during this time.
The next scene, we're in Jake's barber shop where he is giving Lauren a shave, and I feel kind of bad for Lauren because he obviously just doesn't, I'm not sure his motivation for not wanting to admit that he got hurt or not wanting to directly, well, I guess he's embarrassed because it's a lump in a lower region or whatever, but he's like alluding to like, that piano was so heavy, anyone could get hurt. What would you do if you got hurt?
It's that scenario of like, oh, like my friend has this problem.
Yeah.
And, Yeah.
But actually, I guess we should give a nod that Jake is a good friend and is kind of like, what are you talking about? and I was actually surprised when he actually knew what it was right away. He knew it was a hernia.
I know. Mostly because we give him so much crap for the fact that he acts like he knows a lot. But, I mean, hernias are very broad, right? You can have a lot of different types of hernias. But I think it's funny because Jake's like, all right, like, just show me, like, get it over with. And Lauren's like, no. And then he's like, would you rather have that woman look at it? No,
I know,
didn't
it's
think
almost
so.
like a threat.
But, I mean, it's valid, right? It's a good reasoning. And then we have this, like, very next scene where he's like, oh, lacing him up in a corset, basically.
Well, so I wrote corset, but then later they call
say
it
truss.
A truss.
Yeah. But a truss it's actually a supportive undergarment for men that kind of keeps that protruding intestines, or what they call a lump here. It's keeping that in place. It's not used to treat a hernia. It does nothing to treat it, but it's just basically keeping people comfortable while you have that hernia. So
You
Jake,
said in men do only men get hernias?
no, but inguinal hernias, which is what I believe Lauren has, are more common in men. And then femoral, however you want to say it, hernias are much more common in women. So there are lots of types of hernias. I think it's an inguinal hernia, which we get a very good explanation from Dr. Quinn later. But usually it's when a tissue or organ, in this case the large intestine, actually comes through the wall of whatever cavity it's supposed to be in. So in this case, it's that abdominal wall muscle. There's actually two different types. There's indirect and direct. Without going into too much detail, it can be basically when the large intestine comes through the inguinal canal, which is very more prominent in men for reasons I won't go into, or it can be because there's a weakness in that abdominal wall and the intestines stick through that. And it's not actually proven that heavy lifting and hernias are directly related, but it can be with strenuous activity that puts a strain on that abdominal wall, or anything that would cause an increase in internal pressure. So in this case, his lifting, and at his age, it's very common.
Lauren heads back to the mercantile where we see Olive, and he immediately tells her that he needs her help with creating his will. And she makes a comment about, you're not fixing to die, are you? And he's like, you never know.
People die all the time.
Which I thought the connection there was going to be, you had this young man who, died in the saloon. But actually Olive then says, oh, you mean like Maud?
Right.
And then, of course, he brings up Abigail and his grandchild, which is, I give the writers credit for being consistent with Lauren's character in that he blames one person and one person only for their death, and it's Sully. And surprisingly, Olive kind of blows him off about it. She makes a face where she's just like, oh, here we go again, right? Like, this is obviously a consistent thing that he talks about. I don't really know the purpose of this scene, other than maybe to show us that he's still mad at Sully.
Right, and because right after this, they're looking through the stuff, and that's when they find that deed to the property.
Right. Okay.
So I think it's probably for those purposes to... I don't think he ever would have recognized that the property that the homestead was built on still belongs to Maud, which now technically still belongs to him had he not gone looking. So they do... There is no...
Good
actually,
point.
we don't actually find out in that moment.
No, it's a couple scenes later that'll happen.
But he says, you know, like...
But that's the motivation, you're right.
Right. He just says, oh, it's the deed for Maud's property, but we don't actually know what that means.
Yeah. It seems like it's the next day. So I'm assuming it's Sunday because everybody's at
after
church and they're having a picnic and doing some races. And I think one nice thing about this episode, I have some issues with the Colleen plotline.
Me too.
But one thing that I like is in the last episode, both plot lines were very centered around Matthew and what was going on with John and, you know, the immigrants. And then the secondary storyline was about Brian and his female dear Byron. So I think it is a nice transition to have the secondary storyline where it is about Colleen. So they're really trying to balance and give all the children, you know, their own progress and story and all that kind of thing. But we, of course, as with, I don't know, probably middle school, 13, yeah, that's like either middle school or lower, high school.
I was going to ask you, how old do you think she is?
Well, I mean, 2 episodes ago, she was 13. So I don't think that much time has gone by.
No.
So, yeah, I mean, I would assume she's probably middle school, high school, which, by the way, have we talked about any schooling at all yet?
No,
We
not
haven't,
yet.
which is just
Not yet.
interesting.
But it is interesting. And I guess that gives me more perspective because a couple of times I was like, kind of like, what? And then I guess, yeah, middle school's pretty dramatic. You've been teaching middle schoolers for a while, so you can vouch.
I relate, like, I totally understood all of this girl drama. Girls know how to be mean to girls, and
not
the
necessarily
number one way...
from you, but from
from
students.
me. From
I wasn't going to say
my own story. No, not like me. Like from my experience with girls. Girls were mean.
That's what I was saying. I was trying to say,
yeah,
it's not from you when you were in middle school. It's from you with students. But
no,
I mean,
because, well,
I remember you in middle school.
well, and we moved back from Africa when I was in middle school. So you want to talk about a girl who felt like she was really different than the other kids? Yeah, I definitely found that relatable. And yeah, like, we have this girl, Alice, who we've never seen before. Who's obviously ignoring Colleen.
Colleen's obviously obsessed with her.
Yeah, well, Dr. Mike, oh, I thought you two were friends. Like,
no, I totally feel like that's a mom thing to say. Like, oh,
maybe it's a mom thing to say, but I was just like, Dr. Mike, you're cooler than this. Like, if you know, why don't you just ask Colleen about what's happening, not be like, aren't you guys friends? So that she can be like, we used to be, but now she only cares about hair bonnets.
yeah. And she does. She asks Dr. Mike, like, do you think she's prettier than me? And Dr. Mike has this, like, little, I don't want to say speech, but, like, little, I guess it's kind of like a pep talk. It's like, some people, they're like perfume, and everyone just gravitates toward them. But you know what? I wasn't that kind of girl, and you don't need to be. Like,
this is one of the issues that I have with this, is first of all, Colleen says, is she prettier than me? And Dr. Mike says, no, of course not. Which, I just feel really strongly about this with middle school girls. Don't let them compare themselves, right? Well, it should not make Colleen feel better to think that someone is not as pretty as her. You know what I mean? Whether it's true or not, right? Because girls have a low enough self-esteem without being like, well, at least I'm prettier than her, but she's prettier than, you know, and I say this being very guilty of this. And I think a lot of parents do kind of feed into this idea of like, oh, well, I'm not as, you know, skinny as that girl, but I'm not as big as that girl, and my hair's prettier than hers, but she has really nice, you know what I mean? Like this comparing thing. I almost wish that Dr. Mike, and I know, you know, she's new at it and whatever, but I almost wish she had shut it down. And just been like, you're beautiful. She's beautiful. You're not the same person. You don't need to compare yourself to her. You know,
Right.
And then that perfume speech where which is a weird speech anyway, but then at the end of it, you know, Colleen says, well, I don't have that. And Dr. Mike was like, well, you will someday. And I'm like, what if she won't? What if she's introverted and people don't, you know, like, I don't know. This was one of my qualms with, I'm like, I don't think this is how I would want. I'm not a mother, right? But I am a teacher. And so if I was watching this with some of my female middle school students,
you would have paused and been like, okay, so what's wrong with this?
Yeah, let's talk about this. Let's talk about the danger. And believe me, I don't think Dr. Mike meant any harm by it. I think she really was trying to encourage Colleen, because our mom has said that kind of thing to me too. She said, like, you know, well, you might just take a little longer to get there. Like, so there is moments, you know, where I think that is true. Like, we don't all reach the same stages of life at the same time. But I think the part where Colleen was for sure comparing her friendships, comparing her looks, comparing her, you know, she was...
and needed affirmation to feel like that's what made her valuable.
Exactly. And so I definitely, like, I'm happy we get to talk about it, but I'm hoping that more conversations like this happened instead of, you know, maybe a little girl watching the show and being like, oh, I wish I had a mother like Dr. Mike who told me I'm prettier than other girls, you know? Like, that's not healthy for anyone.
Yeah. And I forget who, right after this, somebody asked about, like, oh, where's Sully?
Brian. And he's like, I want him to watch me.
And we see that Sully is over in their little cemetery that they have. And Dr. Mike says, you know, he's visiting his wife's grave. I don't know if you noticed this. There's, like, this weird...
She makes a face.
Yeah, it's, like, I couldn't tell if, like, she looks uncomfortable or she looks,
disappointed.
Yeah, like, it's very weird. And at this point, like, we've had no conversation about, like, oh, do they have feelings for each other or something?
I thought the exact same thing. Yeah.
Like, sure. I think the viewers have maybe thought, like, oh, is something happening there? Like, you know, because they've spent a lot of time together, but it's weird.
And
he why is she
kissed her forehead or whatever, you know?
Right, but it's like there's been no conversation, so I'm like, is she jealous? Is that a look of jealousy?
Well,
what is that?
And if it is a look of jealousy, this stinking stupid. No, it really bothered me, and it's gonna bother me continually through the rest of this episode. I'm just gonna lay it out there, and people may hate me for it, but I really did not like Dr. Mike in a majority of this episode. Like, I really had trouble with her character in this episode, and it starts from, this moment where all Brian says is, oh, he must have really loved his wife a lot, and her face is like, oh my gosh,
what is my life? It's just, again, it's just weird to me because there's been no conversation. So I'm like, girl, what even is that?
They're not committed. They're not pursuing even anything. They haven't even had a conversation that says we're going to pursue something. It's pretty much been that they're really good friends and they really care about each other. And obviously there's, you know, romantic tension that we as the audience have seen. But if you go off the characters themselves, it's probably just both in their own heads, you know? Like, toward each other, they haven't had a lot of, So, it's what I would call a weird beat, and I don't like it.
It was weird. So then we kind of transition over to the cemetery, and Lauren and Oliver there visiting. Well, they're going to visit, you know, and And Olive says something like, oh, like, Sully's here, and Lauren's like, we have an understanding, like, I guess, timing-wise, or it's like, you get your turn, I get my turn, and we don't talk about it, or... But also, I think, like, getting some context to, like, okay, 2 years ago. 2 years is not that long time for, like, your wife and your child to die. In my opinion, I'm like, that's really...
horrible, way. Yeah, no.
Yeah.
It's awful.
And it also, I think, helps me understand why there's still some lingering tension between Lauren and Sully, because I'm like, okay, I think as a viewer, you're like, get over it, like, move on with your life, like, you know what I mean? Like, don't be so mad at him.
Sully even says that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Time we move past this.
Yeah. But part of me is like, I guess I can understand a little bit more, because 2 years is not a long time at all.
And we know also within that time, Lauren has also lost his wife. So
right.
That's 2 years of losing 2, maybe 3. I mean, the baby counts, but they never got to know the baby, which probably makes it worse. But
right.
3 people who you love, yeah, that's... And especially when we'll learn more details about how everything went down, you're like, okay, I can see why Lauren is resentful, why he's bitter. Yeah. But I guess he's so angry because even in that conversation where Sully's like, hasn't it been long enough? And then he whips out, just so you know, Maud's name, or the deed still has Maud's name on it, which means it's mine.
He's like, that was a gift to Abigail. He's like, well, she never actually wrote her name down, so joke's on you.
Rude. Oh, but an interesting thing about this scene was learning that Sully married Abigail without Lauren's permission.
Correct.
Which, I don't know, it gave me a lot more empathy for Lauren, because if you look at culturally what that would mean in the 1800s to marry, like, there's that stupid song. I shouldn't say it's a stupid song. There's that song, present day, that is like...
Are you about to say rude?
Yes. I'm going to marry her anyway. And I'm like, I personally don't really like that song. But it's just interesting, like, how strongly people kind of reacted to that song. And were like, that's so disrespectful to a father. Like, in the modern
in
day,
today's times.
Yeah, can you imagine in the 1800s where, not only was a woman marrying into a family, but also like her dowry and everything that, it was an exchange, and we hear this later, like he had plans for, her future and the future of his store, basically his legacy too, to know that, oh man, he went behind Lauren's back and married his daughter. No wonder this guy hates his guts.
Yeah. And then to have them...
And Sully never, I don't know if he will, but at this point has never apologized for that. And maybe that's because Sully feels that he was justified because Lauren was never going to give his approval anyway.
Right, and we do find out more details later.
But I don't know, it just adds layers to Lauren for me, whereas initially I was like, man, what a grumpy, bitter old man.
Yeah, I agree. We go back to the field where we're having games, and Matthew and Brian play the little, I don't know what it's called. It's like the wheelbarrow
race.
Yeah, wheelbarrow race. And next they're going to do the 3-legged race, and Colleen is trying to find a partner because she's very excited about this. And we see her not be able to find a partner, and people awkwardly partner up when she asks them. And, I mean... The Reverend sees this and asks if she'll be his partner, in which she's like, no. And so he kind of includes her to help judge, but she's like crying by like when that happens, It's kind of like it's just like reiterating what we've already said, that she's feeling left out. She's feeling like she's not one of the perfume girls. Yeah. It's that moment of like being picked last on the team, but she doesn't get picked at all. She gets picked by the preacher.
Yeah. Something like this, in her mind, is the worst thing that's ever going to happen to her. Up until she finds out she didn't get invited to the party. And then that's the worst thing that's ever going to happen to her. Like, right. And for kids this age, because I've been in these conversations with students, around the same age, And, you know, as adults, we kind of want to be like, listen, if this is the worst thing that's ever going to happen to you, your life is going to be great. But to them, they don't see it that way. They're like, I cannot get any lower than this. And so being able to recognize the extreme amount of pain that she is feeling in that moment, like, I was just saying that, like, I get you, Colleen. I'm so sorry. The next day, we are in the clinic when Lauren, very uncharacteristically, delivers, I would assume, some supplies that Dr. Mike ordered recently. But we learn that he is there with ulterior motives, which turns out
I like it.
He actually wants her opinion. He doesn't want her to touch him. He doesn't want her to look at him. But he does want to share with her that he's been having some discomfort. And I really, you mentioned it earlier, but I almost wish Dr. Mike did this more, but then we would kind of not have a good reason for a podcast. But I feel like she explains a hernia so well.
She explains it well, but I also like the way that, and this patients do this all the time, right? They come in and they want help, but they don't really want you to do the things you need to do to be able to help them, which would be to take a history, inspect, like, and so I think, you know, her being like, okay, like, if you don't want me to touch you, you want me to look at it, like, describe it to me. I think she's like actually really trying to help him without being like, get over yourself, like, this is my job, I don't care. Which is what she's thinking. But he says, you know, Jake said it's a hernia. I you know, wore the truss. And then next thing we know, the doorbell's ringing, so she kind of runs over to see Sully. She's basically like, oh, Mr. Bray is here, and he's like, I gotta talk to you about that. He's probably assuming maybe that Lauren's, like, having that conversation. But,
which is why I'm timing Sully.
So he kind of briefly explains that to her. Sully explains, which, by the way, his facial hair is very nice. That's all I'm going to say. And I literally wrote a note, and it's facial hair in all caps. And then...
But then I think do you think that maybe she's frustrated when she learns about the homestead? Because then she comes back in and she's like, you need to get surgery or you'll get gangrene and die. And I'm like, whoa, slow down. Let the guy... He's still processing.
Yeah, and I mean, she comes back, and I'm just going to kind of repeat what she says. She says, you know, did Jake explain the hernia? It's a tear in the stomach muscle, and the intestines stick out, and yeah, you would need surgery basically to push those intestines back up, sew up the tear, and if you don't, they can become strangulated and cut off blood supply to the bowel, which is the large intestine, and it could cause gangrene, which is,
I don't know what gangrene is.
So gangrene basically comes from necrotic tissue, which is when any part of your body loses blood supply, which is something that's really cool about humans, is that we have blood supply to every single part of our body. So if you cut off blood supply to the intestines, that tissue is going to start to die. And if enough of it dies, you can develop gangrene, which can be very, very, very serious. So
I think horses can get gangrene. I think
probably.
I've heard that.
This probably is random to listeners, but Sarah knows things about horses, so that's why she said that. They're probably like, sorry, why are you just like, horses?
That's the only context that I've heard it in.
Yeah, and there's multiple different types of gangrene.
So he doesn't take it well.
No, he doesn't. He basically freaks out and was like, keep away from me with those knives, and by the way, get off my property.
And you too!
Yeah, he kind of has this freak out moment, which is unfortunate because it was going well up till then.
I guess we should say, what is his motivation here? What is the pattern? He's scared. And he doesn't understand it, and
also, yeah, think about the fact that they have never had a doctor. Like, it doesn't matter if you've heard about... He's obviously heard about it. Yeah, it's like cutting someone open with a knife, but no, it's terrifying. Yeah. I think it's surgery is terrifying for people today. So imagine back then when there's very little knowledge and you're trusting someone else to open you up.
More
like, what?
People die from sepsis anyway. When they get
exactly. Very good. No, 100%. You cutting someone open like that, that's a huge thing. Yeah, afterwards, infection can completely take over. So, yeah, it's totally valid, but he does freak out. Is it the same day? Because I know, like, the next scene we're in the clinic again, but it's later on or maybe the next day.
The timing is unclear because it almost to me seems like she just goes back in and Sully's still there from when he was earlier.
Right.
But the body is there and it definitely wasn't there earlier. So I don't really know the timing of, like...
Yeah, imagine if Lauren had seen that. No, but she does say they have the gentleman that had died.
Prospector Sam.
Why did that make me think of Prospector Pete from Toy Story? Anyway, so the autopsy's complete, and she says he has a bad heart and he had a hole in the left ventricle, which it's very interesting because we're in cardiology right now, and the left ventricle is what pumps blood through the aorta, which goes out to the rest of your body. So it's basically responsible for pumping all of the blood in your heart to everywhere else in your body, which is very, 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 very vital. So if you were to have a hole in that, you wouldn't have proper perfusion of that blood to the other extremities, but vital organs and such like that.
So is that believable that he got excited and died? Had a heart attack?
Yeah, I mean, no, not a heart attack. That would be completely different. This is probably, he had exertion. His left ventricle was not able to pump the amount of blood it needed to the rest of his body. And so that means his brain probably was not getting perfused. And so, yeah, I mean, you go without a certain time without blood perfusing your organs, and yeah, you'll die for sure. But then she mentions that she wants to keep the body because she wants to practice sewing up a hernia.
Which back then I'm pretty sure you can only do an autopsy on a body for so long because, you know, she doesn't have it in ice or cold or, right? Like, he's going to start to rot soon or...
It's funny, I didn't even think about that.
I don't know.
Which is, yeah, I mean, cadavers are not just, yeah, I mean, they're preserved. So, that's true. I guess he's just been sitting in there stinking up the clinic. I don't know.
Well, that's what, I just feel like she couldn't keep him for long.
And also, if you don't have blood moving, like, the body becomes pretty rigid and...
creepy.
Yeah. Well, no, yeah, and hard, and so I don't even know if she would be able to, like, I'm not even sure what she was planning on doing, just cutting
Inspecting
abdominal wall muscle and then try to stick his intestines out, but...
We might be getting too graphic for our listeners.
Yeah, they're probably like, okay, too much, shut up and keep going. And again, I don't even know if I agree with this because I'm like, yeah, there are procedures that, I mean, you have to learn how to do, and how do you do them unless you're doing them on real people? I mean, we have things that we can practice on, but I don't know, it's kind of like, she never, you know, this guy's dead. She doesn't get to ask permission, so yeah. It's kind of this weird thing of like, I guess that's just how it is. But Sully, I mean... Well,
they did mention, I think when they were taking him out of the saloon, like, are you sure he doesn't have any family? Which I'm like, I don't know if that... I guess that was her way of being like, okay, I don't need to ask anyone's permission. If he has no family, I can just do what I want with his body.
Sully's like, well...
He doesn't approve.
Yeah, he says we believe that the Cheyenne believe that the dead carry their scars with them to the afterlife. And Dr. Quinn's very interesting. She's like, I believe that the people who are left carry the scars. And
which for 2.5 seconds, I liked it.
I was like, oh, interesting. Yeah, it makes you think. You're like, oh, okay. And then I'm also like, where is she going with this? Because then she's like, don't you think you should put Abigail to rest? And I know it's difficult to let go. And I'm like, I'm sorry. Yeah. Who gave you the authority or like anything to be able to say, like, I was just like, why?
What did you think he was going to respond to that? Oh, you know what, yeah, Michaela, you're right.
Forget about my wife and my dead child. Like, what?
No, yeah,
I know, and it's agree. Like, why?
Just plain insensitive.
Yeah. Not to mention, it's either the day after or 2 days after the 2-year anniversary. Like, I just think, like...
There's no timeline for certain people how long they grieve.
Not to mention, and she should freaking know, like, she lost her fiance. Anyway, without, like, trying to be, like, too negative on her, my main thought was, like, why is she asking this? Like, this is coming out of nowhere. Is it a jealousy thing? Or, like, why? Even if he is your friend, I don't think anyone would respond to their friend that way. Like...
Well, and because I'm a deep feeler, and I definitely think there have been times where I've wallowed in grief longer than I needed to, but if anyone ever confronted me about it, it would be because maybe I'm not eating, not sleeping, not leaving my room, wallowing. Sully is living his life. It's not like it's keeping him from being a person and having relationships. Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. It's not like it's like a breakup and your friend's like, get over yourself and move on. It's like, no, this really traumatic, horrible thing happened, and he's not responding poorly to it. He literally was just at the gravesite, like, showing respect. Like, I don't understand.
Yeah. And he puts her in her place, and he says, why don't you get back to, your autopsy or whatever? You're good at cutting. And I was like,
I know, and I was like, yeah,
Which,
that's another thing that kind of makes you think. You're like, whoa.
I think he had every right to say that. And that's one of the things I don't like about this episode. She never says sorry for saying this. And I feel like she does owe him an apology.
Yeah. We're now at Bray's Mercantile, and Colleen is getting some things, and poor Mr. Bray is having to reach for them, and she's like, are you all right? And he's like, yeah, I'm fine. Meanwhile, he's like
dying,
groaning and moaning in pain, trying to do, normal functions. But Colleen also sees Olive with Alice and some of Alice's little posse, basically. We don't really know their names at this time.
That's true. We never get the names of any of these other girls.
Yeah, and we might later, because I do recognize their faces from later episodes, but everybody is getting invited to Alice's party is what we see. She's having a costume party. Yeah, they're getting invited, and Alice starts to walk out.
Wait,
and Colleen...
Can I talk about the costume party first?
Sure.
I'm going to stand up on my soapbox. Here I am, placing my soapbox. I'm stepping on the soapbox. Individuals of the world, it is never appropriate for someone of non-indigenous ethnicity to wear a costume that is reflective of real indigenous people.
Is that what they were dressing up as?
The girl literally says, I can be Pocahontas, I have beads. Both of these characters that they talk about, they also talk about Lillie Langtry. I love Pocahontas, the person. Her story is far more of a tragedy than a lot of people realize, because most of them have only seen the Disney movie. But I don't understand, because you know how this town reacts to, like, Native American stuff? So it's really weird that this girl was like, I'm gonna be Pocahontas. And I'm like, okay, that's weird, and also super inappropriate, because you're a white girl. And then Alice goes, I'm gonna be Lillie Langtry. Which, if you just Google Lillie Langtry, you'll see she was a very pretty, popular British American socialite, and she was an actress, and she was a producer. She was in high society. She attended a lot of, fashionable gatherings, and so she was, I guess, what we would equate to, a movie star of her decade. Now, remember, if we're imagining that Colorado Springs is this very conservative kind of, churchy town, for the most part, Lillie Langtry was also very famous for being a mistress to many a man, including the son of Queen Victoria, who would become Edward VII, while she was married to someone else, too. She spent a lot of time with a lot of very prominent people, but I'm just imagining Alice's probably church-going mother being like, yes, you can be Lillie Langtry. And I'm like, really? And so I'm just wondering, is this one of those times where they're like, who are two historical figures that people could dress up as that they'll recognize? And I'm like, I don't think these are very good ones. Like, why couldn't you just do Queen Victoria?
I think, it's just, maybe that's what they were thinking. Like, oh, who would these girls want to dress up as? And I think also for us, it's like, we have all this information about those two people, but what kind of information did they have during that time? So
maybe, yeah.
It is interesting.
What was published about Lillie Langtry probably was just...
She's pretty and popular, yeah, which apparently is a very important thing at this time.
Right. And kind of like what we know about Thomas Jefferson, his less admirable qualities, pretty much not many people knew about that in his actual lifetime because he didn't talk about it. So that's a good point. You make a valid historical point in this time period. But I still am going to say that I don't think that Native American or any other race, right, should ever be a quote unquote costume, because it's like that's someone's literal culture and country and way of life.
It is interesting. That wouldn't have been my first guess, that what they would want to dress up as.
Yeah.
And I forgot that they said that. I just remember it being a costume party.
Yeah.
But Alice kind of tries to go walking out, and poor Colleen, she's like so brave, and she's like, "Hi, Alice," and Alice is like, "Hi, Colleen. Okay, bye." And it's like, that's how, it's kind of very clear, like, yeah, she's
being
very
excluded.
Purposefully did not invite you, because it wasn't like, oh, she didn't see me, and she, it was like, no, she did, and she did not invite me.
And that's in the next scene when Dr. Mike finds Colleen crying in the wagon. She says, well, maybe she didn't see you. And she's like, she walked right by me.
Right.
And again, in this scene, I think it's meant to be funny. I don't find it funny.
I mean, I thought it was pretty funny. I thought the last line was pretty funny. But I'm also, this one, I'm like, how old is she? Because she's like literally in this wagon crying.
Well,
I mean,
listen, like I said, this is for them. It is the end of the world. And she's like, I have no friends. Everyone makes fun of me.
Nobody likes me.
Again, I don't really like where she's like, people who are popular when they're young live dull lives when they're over. And I'm like, is this really the message that you're wanting to send to young girls?
I think it's all supposed to make her feel better, right? Like,
but if that's what makes her feel better, is like, you're popular now, your life is gonna be dull. Like, that's such a negative point of view.
Well, and it's silly and not necessarily true. And I mean, maybe. And the more I think about it, the more I'm like, she's still used to this mom thing. Like,
no, but I think even if she had just said the second sentence, which is, people who are different often live to make great contributions in the world. Like, even if she had just said that would have been fine. And then if she had actually thought of a lot of really cool people, because obviously she knows, like, Florence Nightingale, like, but then she goes, like, who? Abe Lincoln. And listen, I know it's supposed to be funny. I don't think it's funny because Colleen goes, yeah, they shot him.
No, I thought it was really funny. I thought it was a laughing out loud mom moment, because I was like, yeah, she's still new at this mom thing, and she's kind of utterly failing, let's be honest.
Yeah.
At least when it comes to pep talk, girl talk advice things.
Yeah, that's a good point. We next find Lauren and Sully having a fight at the Mercantile, where Lauren is laying down his decision that he owns the land, therefore Sully has no claim for it. And Sully shouts out, ever heard of squatters' rights? Which I was like, I have heard of squatters' rights. I don't know what they are.
Same.
So I looked it up. In the 1830s, squatters' rights, also known as preemption, was where someone had the right to purchase property that they had improved. And it was geared toward settlers, especially in the West, who, got on a wagon, headed out west, picked a plot of land, built a house, had started a farm, growing crops, whatever. They didn't have money probably when they moved out there, but then the hope is once they've started to make revenue from this farm, whatever, then they make some money. Now, because they had improved that land, not anyone could just walk in and be like, I'm going to buy this land, but they said, we've improved this land, and therefore we have first right to purchase the land. So the idea behind it, I think, was very positive. And so in 1841, Henry Clay kind of was a part of the making this preemption law that allowed people to have these, these rights to property that they had invested in. Unfortunately, within the year, the law had led to a lot of corruption, a lot of people illegally, claiming, oh, I can get this land at a cheaper price if I just convince them that I've done something to it. And, back then there's no photographs, there's no, if you want to go check that people have actually invested in land, you have to like send someone out, to see it. So it was like within a year, the law had kind of fallen apart. So actually almost 30 years later, a renewed act was the Homestead Act of 1862, speaking of President Lincoln, where Lincoln signed the Homestead Act, which the purpose of the Homestead Act was very similar in mindset, and it had to do with settlement and development of the American West. And it actually gave African Americans the opportunity to own land for the first time in U.S. history. So it was about improving and developing the West, but it was also this idea of once the slaves are free, where are they going to go? And so it was this step towards giving them the opportunity, not necessarily the right, but the opportunity to own land. I think here what Sully's argument would be, Maud owned the land, but Sully built the homestead and the barn, and so therefore, by this law, he would have the right to purchase the land based on the fact that he made improvements to it, whereas Lauren just has the deed but has done nothing with the land.
Nothing. And we also see that Lauren is drinking because he's still having a lot of hernia pain.
This is where we find out that Lauren had actually planned more or less an arranged marriage for Abigail. He had a guy lined up to marry her who was going to come work in the store and take over when he died. And then we get, Sully's trying to help, and he's like, I loved my daughter, and Sully's like, well, then why'd you close your door to her?
Right.
And Lauren actually gets a pretty good goat, horse, and bean. He gets a good punch in on Joe Lando's face.
But I love that, Sully doesn't fight back.
He doesn't.
He tries to calm Lauren down, control him from hurting anybody else, including himself, which he does. But he has no intentions of hurting Lauren or fighting back. Olive kind of comes running at this point, and that's when Lauren kind of yelps in pain and collapses. And Dr. Mike is already there, and I don't know, this kind of bothered me because she's like, just from him like yelping and collapsing, she's like, your hernia is strangulated and I need to cut you open. Like, I'm not really sure. I don't think that's how it works. And I think it's hard for me sometimes because so much of what I'm learning in PA school is like, okay, so if this happens, like, oh, we might order these tests to rule something in or rule something out. And they don't really have that luxury at this time.
No.
So I guess she's just making, an assumption, the most likely assumption that that's what's happened because, I don't know, because he's in pain and right before Lauren actually loses consciousness, he's like, you can't cut me. And then he loses consciousness, and then Dr. Mike's like, okay, Olive, I need your permission. And she's like, what do you mean? He just told you he doesn't want it to happen. He's not in his right mind or whatever. I need you to give me consent. He might die if he doesn't. And she's like, well, have you done it before? And she's like, well, I've never done it with these complications, which, by the way, what does that mean? But she says, he's going to die if I don't try. And so reluctantly, Olive says, okay, even though it is, I don't know, it's not even like this thing of like, oh, Lauren didn't make his wishes known. He did. But I guess they're just hoping that someone can make better choices for him.
Well, and I guess they could argue he is drunk.
Yeah, no, it's true. He's not in his greatest state of mind.
So she agrees, and next thing we know, because this town has nothing better to do, they're all placing bets on whether Lauren lives or dies, which I'm like, I get it. If it's funny, what they're really betting on is whether or not Dr. Mike's gonna kill him or not. But I'm like, you guys know at the end of this, some of you might win money where your friend has
died. Yeah.
Like that, that something about that doesn't sit well with me. And I do like that even when Horace is the first one to agree to it, the Reverend is like, Horace! I'm like,
And then Myra's like, yeah, count me in, my $3.
they're getting ready for the surgery, and Jake
He's trying to talk to an unconscious Lauren.
trying to be like, dude, you just gotta wake up so you can tell him not to do it.
Which is just funny to me because he's completely unconscious.
And then
he's
of course, super judgmental about Colleen being in there.
But it is funny because Olive is like, I'm not squeamish. And Jake's like, I need to be here to look after Lauren. Colleen's helping. And Dr. Mike's like, cool, so we're going to open this book and we're going to read what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah, how do you feel about that? Like, reading, I don't know. She did the same thing with the cookbook, right? Where she was reading the book as she did it. From my experience, you're supposed to read all the directions first before you go.
That's such a teacher thing to say.
That isn't. You're right. Oh my gosh, it is. That is such a teacher thing. Read everything before you do anything.
Again, and without spoiling too much, we see this in later episodes when perhaps she has to do something she's never done before, reading the book. I don't know. I mean, sure, I get it, but most people would study beforehand.
Yeah, but when you're in surgery, right? Like, you're not looking at a book. You're not looking at instructions.
No, of course. But also, I mean, in today's time, there's more than one surgeon there. You're going to have people there with helping. And so it is difficult, right? She's the only medical person there. Nobody else can be like, oh, maybe do this, don't do that, don't forget about this. Like, it's just her and her knowledge. And at this point, you know, it's limited. So, yeah, it is kind of interesting. But they use chloroform. We kind of talked about chloroform over the mouth and nose. But everyone's kind of looking at each other right before Dr. Mike cuts. It's like this moment of like, okay. And Horace is still watching. And
it's the most unsure we've ever seen Dr. Mike about a procedure, which I'm sure is on purpose. But if you think back to the last number of episodes where, you know, she's like, this is what we need to do. I know what I'm doing. You know, you need to trust me. This episode, she's almost the opposite. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not sure if he's going to make it. I can't guarantee, you know, when we look at the progression of her character, just because I think we talked about this early on, you know, she always puts on this front, even when she doesn't know something, where she would like act like she did.
Which is why I'm surprised.
And so I think it goes to show how much more comfortable she's becoming in being more vulnerable and being more honest and recognizing, which I think is, I don't know how you feel about it from a medical perspective, but just from a personal standpoint, I feel like that's healthy, because you can't fake your way through everything. At some point you have to acknowledge that you don't have all the answers, but you can only do the best that you're going to do. And I think the beautiful thing that's going to happen with her and Olive later is that's exactly, Olive's going to recognize that. I know that you are going to do everything you can, and I'm grateful for that. So that is something that I like.
I did too.
That this scene, I like that we don't see any of the gore, but we get all the gore from Horace's descriptions through the window, which I didn't remember how consistent this theme was, that the people of Colorado Springs have nothing better to do than find out what Dr. Quinn is doing and entertaining them for a couple hours.
Yeah. Well, and so that is what happens. They make the cut, and then Olive is like, actually, on second thought, maybe not. I like that Dr. Mike is talking through stuff and Colleen is asking questions, but Dr. Mike quickly realizes it's a larger tear than she thought. Then Jake starts getting nauseous, and he kind of starts getting nauseous, and then Dr. Mike is talking through how risky this is going to be because she has to cut around the tear, but she can't nick the bowel or that could contaminate the wound, which is true, by the way. That's something you want to watch out for, because the bowel, well, think about what the bowel is full of, and if you do nick that, then all that stuff is going to leak into your abdominal cavity, which could cause so much infection. I wish everybody could see your face right now. And so, Jake faints. And did you notice how everybody is very sweaty?
They're all sweaty.
They did a good job. I like that, because I'm like, that's accurate. Even Dr. Mike is like wiping her forehead because she's sweaty. And
sanitary.
Let's think about the fact that she's putting her bare hands into his abdomen. I mean, you do what you gotta do. But it made me laugh that Horace is like, Jake fainted, and everybody outside is like busting up laughing. But I also like how they're like, oh, is he breathing? Great, we'll attend to him later.
Yeah.
Horace is still narrating. He's like, this looks dangerous. The Reverend is praying.
Oh, the Reverend's so cute.
I know. And I like that Sully is like encouraging her too. He's like, you got this.
He is.
You know?
Well, and especially, we didn't really talk about it, but they have that little tiff, but then the next time they see each other, they don't acknowledge it. They just are back where they started, which I think, like I said, I still think she owes him an apology, but it's mature because they don't hold grudges. They are not Lauren Bray.
We've seen that before. Sully, he's
actually very quick to forgive, I think.
Yes, he is. No, I do agree with that. She's using a spoon to kind of gently push his intestines back into the cavity. And Horace is like, she's scooping his guts with a spoon. It's like, oh my gosh. Then she's a little dramatic. I don't know. She's like,
gotta bleed her.
Yeah, I don't know how I feel about that, but you know what?
Is that real terminology?
Someone who's a real surgeon can let me know. I've been in a number of operating rooms, but I've never seen a hernia repair. So, yeah, I mean, things get nicked all the time, but I don't know. Just the way that she was it was just interesting the way that she went about it. But she ties the vein off and sutures him up, and
the end of the scene is Olive coming in and hugging a very uncomfortable looking Sully. And
I know
there's a lot of hugging in the rest of this episode, and then it's Dr. Mike hugging Colleen, and I'm gonna point out every time people get hugged in the rest of this episode because it's so much hugging.
Which, yeah, I'm only laughing because you guys, let me just share a little sister snippet with you. Sarah doesn't really like hugging that much, and I love it.
I'm like, oh, they're hugging again.
But I literally wrote that to him, like, oh, Mike and Colleen are hugging, Olive and Sully are hugging, and Jake missed the whole thing.
What is it? My physical touch is not one of my love languages. Let's put it that way.
Oh, well, I just wanted to say something really quick. Like, hernia repairs today, you can have an open hernia report, or a lot of them are laparoscopic, where you have those little, have you ever seen those little robot arms, and they actually make incisions and the robots can go in and do it. And so people don't necessarily always have a lot of scarring with that, but normally you can go home the same day, and then recovery's 3 to 4 weeks.
Did Dad have a hernia once?
I was going to say, yes, our dad did. Oh. He did have a hernia repair. Yeah, let's just share our dad's medical information with the internet.
We'll ask him if we're allowed to share that, but I thought I remembered that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's one of the main things that they monitor those patients afterward is for infection, because it can occur, and usually those patients are on antibiotics for that reason. Yeah, go ahead. You were talking about we're back at the clinic.
Well, I don't know if I think we're still at the clinic.
Right.
Alice, who we find out is Emily's niece.
Emily, I love how they just find a way to fit her into every episode somehow. She's related to a lot of people and has a lot of children and loves Dr. Mike.
Yep. Alice has come over to invite Colleen to the birthday party, and Colleen is ecstatic. The next day, we are confirmed it's the next day because we know that Lauren has made it through the night, though he has not awakened. And poor Olive actually seems worried sick about him, and we learn that Lauren is significantly older than Olive. He was an only child for a time, and she said, he's been mad at me for my whole life for being born. He was awful to me.
Is that how you feel about me?
And all I want to say is this is how
you feel about me. Yeah, just tell him.
Okay, so Kelly and I are 5 years apart. I was an only child for 5 stinking years, and then this little chubby, cute little French baby came into the world and ruined all my plans. And then bam, bam, right after that, we had 2 more brothers, and I shouldn't make too much light of it because the 5-year gap was not planned. Our mother did struggle with some infertility stuff. But the point is,
So I am a blessing to the world.
So she's a miracle baby, and unfortunately she ruined my 5. Can you imagine being 5-year-olds are selfish little brats. And can you imagine being an only child where you were your parents' whole world for 5 years, and then
oh my gosh, you're so dramatic.
and she's friggin' cute, and she ruined everything. And this child, let me tell you about this child. My memories of Kelly when she was a baby was that I would poke her because, older sister, but she would scream as loud as she possibly would, as though I had punched her, and my mom would come in and I would get in trouble because the baby was screaming bloody murder, and all I did was stinking poke her.
That is not what happened.
That is...
It's called playing the game smart, my friends. But that is funny that you said that, because she was like, he hasn't forgiven me since the day for being born, and I was like,
I totally kind of understand this, but I think it's also true. She said he's been awful to me forever, and I was not a very nice big sister, but I would say that she says, but he did protect me from anyone else, and I would say that, not necessarily that I stood in front of bullies for you, but I would never let anyone be mean to you in the way that I'm mean to you. That is
I think
true.
most siblings are that way. It's like, yeah, I can talk smack about them, but you're not allowed to.
And I like Dr. Mike says, it's difficult to live with them even when you love them. And I'm like, grr,
Snaps.
ain't that the truth?
But anyway, and even I like how Olive's like, Lauren comes across but a certain way, but he really is soft, and he's all I got. And I'm extremely grateful to you, Dr. Mike, for trying to save him. Because I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the first time that that Olive actually acknowledges, like, okay, we've had our differences, but I respect you, and that's gonna stay no matter what, which is very, very mature.
Yeah. Well, and I also like almost the way that she says that line. It's like, and if he doesn't make it, I almost... When I was watching, I was like, it's going to be like I'll never forgive you, or like,
Right.
I'll make you pay. And she's like, and if he doesn't make it, I want to thank you for doing everything that you could to save him. And I respect you. And guess what? They hug and cry.
I literally, and this is what's so funny, is I wrote first hug in all caps, and then I put a little smiley face.
Again.
Yeah. And Dr. Mike starts crying.
Yeah. It's a good scene. Then
Colleen
is in town. She bumps into the girls. She very excitedly tells them that she has planned her costume, and she's going to be Florence Nightingale, which I think most people, again, this is a name maybe you've heard of, but maybe you don't know much about her. She's considered a writer, statistician, English reformer, and the founder of modern nursing.
Yes. I do remember learning about Florence Nightingale in elementary school, maybe 4th or 5th grade.
The reason she was called an English reformer is because she lived from 1820 to 1910, and something she really focused on, which as I was reading and watching some videos about her, she really advocated for clean and sterile medical spaces. And so things that were not common practice that now are, laundering bandages, providing fresh food, clean water for, especially she served as a war nurse during the Crimean War, which, if you don't know, that was a war from 1853 to 1856. The short version is it was about Christian minorities in the Holy Land, and there were a lot of different countries, including like the Ottoman Empire, that were involved. But she really advocated for sterile, sanitized, I don't know what the better word is, working environments, medical. And they say that because she was such a stickler for that, is some of the reason why so many patients who were under her care or in the hospitals or makeshift, medical stations, that's why a lot of them survived, because of these extra measures that she took, which now I'm sure you, having worked in the hospital, would be like, that would be insane if you didn't do all those things. But
right.
That was not normal practice during that time. And she really advocated for that and initiated for that. And so I think as far as like public health goes, in the true words of calling her a reformer, she really reformed what was the norm. And it really was for the better.
Yeah, and it makes sense why someone like Colleen would want to be her. But in this excited moment of sharing with them, she walks by and ends up hearing them talk about, why did you invite her? And they're like, my aunt made me. They actually turn around and realize that she heard, which is like, oh, the worst moment, because now it's not even like, oh, you just said it, but like she heard you. So
well, do you think, I don't know, I wouldn't put it past middle school girls to have consciously, you know what I mean, like knowing they were like, still close enough to hear. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And so Colleen immediately goes to the mercantile where she confronts Dr. Mike. I wish that she had expressed more why she was angry, because she doesn't. She just kind of, even into the next scene where she walks out into the meadow and Dr. Mike goes after her, you know, she doesn't ever say why she's angry. She just says, you know, Dr. Mike's like, I was trying to help. She's like, you just made it worse. And I just would like to know a little bit more what Colleen is feeling. Is she feeling disappointed that these girls didn't invite her herself? Is she feeling angry that Dr. Mike, you know, tried to fix it? Is she feeling, you know, embarrassed that Dr. Mike had to ask for her to be invited? Like, I just would really like to know what it is that has upset her so much. And maybe it's a combination of all of the three. Yeah. But Colleen never actually says herself what it is. But I like Dr. Mike then says, and I think this is, she's tried to give advice multiple times, right? I think she finally gets it right here, and this is what I really hope the message is that young girls, you know, take away, girls and boys, anyone. If you're happy with who you are and what you're doing, you'll find the friends who are right for you. And I think that should be the message. Because all these other things, or these two other times she gave advice, it was like looking at other people. Oh yeah, she has this. You don't have it yet. You're prettier than her. It's okay. You know, they're popular now, but later their life will be dull. But here she says the only person, Colleen, you know, that you need to worry about is yourself. If you're happy with who you are, and if you're not happy with who you are, then no one else is going to change that, right? Like, that's you. You can work on yourself. So, like I said, I really like this. When you find those people that are meant to fit with you, that, like, it'll happen when you're comfortable with yourself, when you're not looking at, oh, I wish I was like her, had what she had, or could do what she, you know, and stop comparing yourself and just look at yourself. You know, my perspective on that as like a Christian would then be like working in God to that. Who I am in Christ has nothing to do with what other people are saying or doing. It's who I am in Him. And guess what? At the end of the scene, they hug.
You're hilarious. We are back at the clinic because, in case you guys were wondering, we don't know what happened to Lauren yet. They're all kind of there waiting for Lauren to wake up. And sure enough, he does, and they inform him we repaired the hernia, and he's pretty, can I say pissed? He's pretty pissed. He tries to get up, and they're trying to lay him down because they don't want him to do more damage. Somehow he's convinced that Sully was
trying to kill him.
Sully did it trying to kill him, which is like, okay, 0 to 100.
And I like that Dr. Mike says, you know, we're all fighting as hard as we can to keep you with us. And that seems to be what calms him down a little bit, because he's like, wait, I'm dying?
Well, and then we have another one of those things that kind of annoys me, because she's like, oh, he has a weak and rapid pulse. He needs blood transfusion. I'm like, okay, that could be a number of things. Like, in fact, you know, with just like inspiration, like your pulse can actually increase, and when you expire, it can decrease. So I'm not saying that's the case here, but I'm saying like, your pulse can change with so many different things. And so, I don't know, it just kind of bothered me again that she just, like, jumps to this massive conclusion.
Let me talk to you about, I want to see if I actually have some doctor knowledge. She wants to do a blood transfusion, and Olive says, I'll do it. And she says, no, we have a better chance of it matching if it's from a man. From my knowledge of blood and blood types, actually, the chances probably would have been better if Olive would have done it because she's related to him, right? So the probability that they're the same blood type was likely higher than Sully. I don't think does it have anything to do with gender? It doesn't, right?
That would be correct. Good job. I was giving you the look like to make
Yeah,
you think you
did.
weren't
I was
right,
like,
but you
no,
were
I
right.
thought I knew a thing. For the story, we need it to be Sully.
Well, for the story, but also that, so here's the thing. Everybody kind of today knows about blood typing, right? You know you're going to be A, you're going to be B, you can be AB, or you can be O. And we know about that now, but blood typing did not occur until 1901. And we actually learned about this in class because they talk about it a lot, because this actually is why a lot of women died in childbirth. So we could think about Abigail even, is because of something called the rhesus factor. I don't want to go into too much detail, but basically not only do we know about AB, and O, we know about positive and negative, right? Most people know, like me, I'm O positive. What are you,
Yeah.
O positive?
I think we're all O positive except for Mom, who's negative.
So, like, people don't know about that, but your baby can actually be a different rhesus factor, could be positive or negative. Anyway, without going into too much detail, they didn't know about that then. So 1901 was when blood typing was being discovered, but in 1907 was when they figured out about cross-matching, meaning, if you have incompatible blood, so you're basically mixing incompatible blood, that can actually affect someone's prognosis. So this case, they didn't know about that, so the assumption was, it's a man, it's most likely from a man. But yeah, you'd be correct in saying that it probably would have been more likely that blood transfusion would have been successful with Olive, because they had the same parents. The rhesus factor thing didn't even come till like 1939, 1940. So when you think about in the time span, like, that's still relatively recent when you're talking about medicine.
And Dr. Mike in the next scene does kind of mention that when she's prepping Sully, like, she says sometimes it doesn't work. And she says we don't know why, which I was like, but I think I know why. It's blood types. And it's interesting because this is the first time, she's definitely blamed herself for other people's deaths, like Maud or Charlotte. But this is the first time where she actually expresses to Sully that she's worried that if Lauren dies, everyone will blame her. I was like, why would she care about that now? And maybe it's because these people aren't strangers that she's having to prove herself to anymore. Maybe it's because these are her friends, right? She doesn't want to let Olive down. She doesn't want, like, the people in the town to no one to want anything to do with her anymore, because they think, that she killed Lauren against his will, more or less. So I was like, that's a interesting, just character peek behind the curtain.
The first successful blood transfusion didn't happen till 1818. There was a British guy who basically gave because at the time, for a long time, they were using animal blood.
Wait, and do animals have blood types? Like us? Or they're totally different?
That's a good question. They do, because every blood is going to have antibodies to other types, but I'm not sure exactly how it works, to be honest, with animals. But obviously they're not always successful. And why is that, right? Because, again, they didn't know anything about mixing incompatible blood. And the reason that happens is because you can actually trigger an immune response. Everybody's red blood cells have antibodies against other blood types. So if you're going to give me a blood type that my body has antibodies to, it's going to react in basically an immune response that's going to cause those red blood cells to clump, which is an issue, because if you are clumping, you're going to have a lot of lysis, which is basically just the breaking open of those cells. And now you're going to have free hemoglobin, and that can cause death. And so a lot of these transfusions were not always successful, which Dr. Mike says, and they don't know why. Well, that's why, because you're causing your body to have an immune response to something that it should not be there. I think it's interesting because I would be more concerned about this than I would be concerned about the fact that she cut him open and tried to put his intestines back in, because this could start going horribly wrong, to be honest. And now, I mean, we know a lot about, like, bloodborne pathogens and diseases that are carried with blood. So, I mean, you could be, I don't think Sully has anything crazy, but I'm just saying, like, what if he did? And now you're passing it to someone that's increased age with higher risk. So the transfusion is happening, and, Lauren and Sully are stuck in the same room together. And he's like, Lauren's basically like, why are you doing this? Right? Like, is it about the land? And Sully's like, I don't care about the land. I like when he says that. He's like, I don't care about the land.
That line's so good, because I think the performance even in that line you can hear it's almost like, I am not fighting the battle that you're still trying to fight with me. And to take us away probably from all the emotions of that scene, we get Colleen has gone out to pick some flowers for Mr. Bray, and she is walking back and actually sees Alice and one of Alice's friends, and I guess they have heard the news that Colleen assisted, and they are all into, tell us what it was like, tell us about his intestines, tell us about the blood.
Did you see his insides?
Yeah, and I mean, I think
I declare.
it's a cool moment for Colleen too, because she doesn't even like pridefully be like, oh yeah, I did this and it was cool. It's more just like, oh yeah, like I'm learning about this and this thing happened, but you know, I don't know. I like the way that she doesn't revel in the way that the girls are impressed, but it almost is like, oh yeah, like this was something she really enjoyed getting the opportunity to do, and they're excited to talk to her about it. And she smiles, you know, when they're walking away, and they're like, I bet she'll become a doctor too.
I love that. Outside the clinic, Sully and Dr. Mike are there, and Dr. Mike is just saying, like, we're going to find out soon what happened, if the transfusion worked. But she's more kind of expressing, like, I hope we don't have to leave the homestead, you know? And he's like, well, where would you go? I guess they would move into the clinic, but I didn't even think about this. She's like, you know, I'm not really sure how the children would feel about being in the same place that their mother died. Sully's like, oh yeah, well, you better prepare them for that to possibly happen.
And honestly, I think they could have cut this scene and put more of these reasons into the kids' discussion when I think she could have just, like, prepared them at home without Sully being like, you should prepare them, and have the kids voice some of those things, like, because to me, when she does tell them, Matthew's like, all the people coming and going, which I'm like, there have been plenty of people coming and going injured from the homestead too, right? And then he's worried about his horse and the other animals. And then Colleen's like, the chickens can't go to Robert E. And I'm like, Brian's worried about his pup. But anyway, actually, yeah, like having a place to live. I don't know. I just feel like it would have been more meaningful for the kids to voice some of those things. Like, I don't want to move back. Like, we left there. Our mom died there. It's your clinic. I just felt like those two scenes could have been
looped together.
One that would have made the kids' reasons for not wanting to go stronger. Instead, it felt a little less emotional for the kids. And then Dr. Mike was really emotional alone.
After they voice all their concerns, it's like, well, when will we have to leave? And she's like, yeah, so probably tomorrow. You know, and she's like, I'm sure everything will be fine. And all the kids basically get up and leave. And it's just kind of like this wowzers, like, mom moment of like, so that went well.
Exactly. and then Colleen is like, are you glad? You don't sound glad. And it's her first home. And then Colleen hugs her.
Back at the clinic, we have Lauren, who's pulling through, and
Lauren hears Sully's voice and yells at, don't be creeping around, come in here. Because he literally just came to check if Lauren was okay and then was gonna leave.
I like it. It's like a grumpy old man moment, but I like it.
I like how Lauren admits, you wrecked all my plans, and you think it's gonna be the same speech that he's been giving. But then he says, but I recognize that they were my plans.
And that I was too proud to tell her that.
Yeah, and then we learn he actually went so far as to disown Abigail, and Sully reassures him. He reassures him.
Like, she never stopped loving you, even despite that.
He goes to give him an envelope that he doesn't want to take, and he's like, why are you so stubborn? And probably the same reason you are. And
I like that.
But I think what I like most about this scene is you realize that maybe Lauren isn't as mad at Sully as he kind of pretends to be. I think he's more mad at himself. Because she died.
Yeah, he has regret.
And he feels like, like he failed her. He failed to love her in the way that he wanted to. And not just even when she chose to go with Sully, but even before that, in the making his plans for her life kind of thing, you know?
Yeah. it's funny how, like, he's able to voice all that, but then he's still like, okay, like, get out of here, like, you just gonna not let this old man get some sleep, like, still trying to, like, play it off of, like, we didn't just have this, like, very nice life-changing moment thing. And it's very cute. Sully goes to leave, but then ends up sitting in the chair, kind of watching Lauren to make sure that he's okay and taken care of. I just love Sully.
And then we're packing up the homestead, and I would be so stinking mad because they're like packed up half their stuff.
Basically
and Sully
done.
gets there and was like, guess what? You don't have to move. And they're like, what do we do with this stuff? And she's like, oh, just put it back. And I'm like, I would be so mad.
No, I literally pictured Mom being like, are you kidding me?
And guess what? They all hug.
Yay. And then it's like, oh, what is Dr. Mike doing? There's like this trunk, and she says, this is all Abigail's stuff, and what should we do with it? And Sully actually thinks for a while, and then he says, give it all to Lauren, which is a nice way to tie all of this episode together, and the, like, okay, they've reconciled, they've had the hard conversations.
But I don't like it.
I gathered from the look on your face.
I mean, he looks at his wedding photo. Like, he's allowed to keep his stinking wedding photo.
I know, but maybe he doesn't want to. I don't think he says that because he's like, oh, Dr. Mike told me I should get over this. Let me just get rid of all this stuff. I don't think that's what it is. I think maybe it's too painful. The reason that he didn't go through the home... Remember when she moved into the homestead, everything was just like it was, So it's I think it's painful for him, and he doesn't want to have to relive that all the time, so...
I know, but
it's not like it's gone forever.
It's like the next part too, where she like invites him for dinner again, which is like their thing, her inviting him for dinner.
Yeah, it's normal.
But then, I don't know, it's a weird beat, because then she's like, will you stay for dinner? We have a lot to celebrate. And I'm like what? Him deciding not to keep his wife's trunk?
See, it's interesting how you always think of things that I never think of. No, because I'm like, oh, they're celebrating the fact that, I don't know, they don't have to move out of their house. He's reconciled with Lauren.
I'm sure that those are the reasons, right? Lauren's okay. They don't have to move. But it's the timing of it. The timing, right? Like, yeah. I'm okay with them showing progress in their relationship. Like, I've never fallen in love with a man whose first wife died. So I recognize that this is and will be a conflict in their future relationship, which, as we've established, they don't have a relationship right now that is romantic. But I'm like, it makes sense that this would be a conflict in their relationship whenever that relationship decides to happen. I just don't feel that this was the moment to introduce it into their relationship.
Gotcha. And that's the end of the episode, so please tell me. I feel like there's a lot of scenes you could choose from here, but what would you say was your favorite scene?
I think my favorite scene is Dr. Mike finally getting the advice right and saying, if you're happy with who you are and what you're doing, then you'll find friends who are right for you. I like that scene for Colleen's character, for Dr. Mike's character, and for all the young and old viewers watching the show.
For me, I feel like I always pick the cliche.
I know what scene you're going to pick. Can I guess? You're going to pick when Sully stays after they talk about her loving him. Her Abigail loving him.
Yeah. I mean, the scene where they talk about it and then he stays, yeah.
As soon as I watched that scene, I was like, this is going to be Kelly's favorite scene.
I'm predictable, what can I say? But I just...
Not predictable, consistent.
I don't know what to say. I also just, I just know so many people, not so many people, but that kind of, old man thing of, let myself be vulnerable, be soft, but then also be yeah, just kidding. Let me go back to my normal self and be okay, enough of this. So that's what kind of makes me laugh, because Lauren is definitely like that, and it makes him likable, but I like the conversation they have for obvious reasons. So what about ranking? We currently are
The Pilot, The Visitor, The Law of the Land, epidemic. The thing is, I think that there are a lot of things in this episode that don't work.
It's kind of like the last episode we were saying, like, there's a lot of good stuff, but the way it's presented is not the best. And this one is not in the exact same way, but...
The Law of the Land, the problem that I had with that episode more so was the ending. Like, than the whole episode, it's like the whole story itself. This one, it's bits and pieces of kind of the whole thing that I have trouble with. But then I really like Lauren and Sully's character development in this episode. And at the same time, I don't want to be like, I'm really glad that Colleen finally got her own storyline, because so far she hasn't really had one, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Whereas I feel like this one she's experiencing some genuine, very relatable hurt and disappointment in her life, and kind of learning how to deal with that. I think I actually would put this at the bottom of the list.
Wow.
I mean, we only have 5 episodes. What are you thinking?
No, I'm comfortable with putting this in 5th place. Not because it's a bad episode.
Yeah, exactly. It's not a bad episode, but out of all the ones so far, I think this is the one that I've had the most struggle with big chunks of it.
Yeah. If you're good with that, I'm good with it.
Please make sure to let us know what you thought about this episode. Don't forget that you are more than welcome to write in lessons that you think characters learned in this episode. I feel like there's a lot of content that you guys could write in about to us. If you're interested in writing in or want to learn more about the podcast, you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, our website, which is www.notaladypodcast.weebly.com, Not a Lady Podcast, all one word, as well as our email, notaladypodcast@gmail.com. And we just want to thank you for listening to this episode of Not a Lady, a Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman podcast. If you like this episode, you can support us by liking or sharing our content on social media.
Be sure to join us for our next episode, Season 1, Episode 6, Father's Day.
Thanks for listening.
A bientôt!